It began with the sound of bells and rain. I had been sitting by the window of my flat on North Parade, a glass of whisky gone tepid on the table beside me, watching the evening stretch thin over the spires. The bells came from Magdalen, distant and mournful, diffused through the drizzle until they sounded less like a call to prayer and more like an echo of something already lost. Oxford has a way of doing that, turning sound into memory before it even reaches your ears. That night I was not expecting work. Crimes, like visitors, arrive in moods, and the city had been unusually quiet. I'd convinced myself I could almost enjoy the rare quietude of a man who has made peace with the thought that not every unanswered question is a summons. But then came the knock soft, uncertain, and somehow apologetic, as though the one who made it wished not to disturb even his own errand. Lewis entered, smelling faintly of rain and petrol. He said there'd been a death at St. Hilda's. A don, or rather, a former don, retired 2 years. Found that evening in her sitting room. The gas fire was still burning, though the windows were open to the storm. He hesitated before adding the inevitable. It looked like suicide. I have never much liked the word. Too conclusive, too eager to end the matter before the beginning has even shown its face. I told him as much, though less a statement than a thought spoken aloud, and he nodded with that patient tolerance that made him, against all logic, my truest companion in work. We drove through the rain toward the college, wipers ticking like an anxious metronome. The streets were empty, except for the scattered shapes of bicycles glinting beneath lamplight. Somewhere near the Botanic Garden, a fox darted across the road, its eyes catching the beam, a brief flare of the wild amid all the ordered civility. I envied it. The porter at St. Hilda's met us with the solemnity of a man rehearsing grief. He led us through cloisters that smelled of damp wool and polish. The corridor lights flickered, and in that intermittent glow I noticed the smallest thing, an umbrella stand, overturned but carefully set back upright. The kind of correction people make only after a shock, when the world must be made to look normal again. Inside the sitting room, she lay half-slumped in an armchair, her spectacles still in place, a copy of Middlemarch face down beside her. I bent to pick it up instinctively. The page was marked near the end, Dorothea's reconciliation with Will Ladislaw. Not the sort of passage one reads before deciding to die. The police surgeon muttered something about carbon monoxide. I barely heard him. I was listening instead to the quiet, thick, velvety silence of a room recently emptied of conversation. Lewis moved about, opening drawers, asking the gentle questions that sound like sympathy but are meant for record. I wandered to the mantelpiece. There, between framed photographs, stood a small brass bell, the kind used in old tutorial rooms to summon students or end a session. Its handle was smudged with something pale, almost powdery. I touched it. Talcum, perhaps, or plaster. Either way, it did not belong in that room. I remember thinking how odd it was that even in death her posture seemed formal. One hand resting on the armrest, the other folded against her lap, as if expecting someone to arrive. Outside, the bells began again, louder this time, closer. I turned toward the open window and saw the rain drift sideways across the quad, blurring the lamps into trembling halos. And it struck me then not the cause of death, nor its motive, but something quieter, more obstinate. There was a clock on the mantel, stopped at 7:23. Yet the college bells had rung only 5 minutes ago, at 8. Someone had wound it wrong or stopped it deliberately. It was, perhaps, nothing. But I have lived long enough to know that in Oxford nothing remains so for long. The next morning Oxford looked as though the night had washed it clean but forgotten to dry it. The streets glistened faintly, and the air carried the thin smell of wet leaves and iron. I arrived at St. Hilda's again just after 8, half hoping the world might have rearranged itself in my absence, that the woman in the armchair might have decided, after all, to turn the page and carry on reading. But death is a stubborn editor. It deletes without revision. Lewis was already there, speaking to the college secretary, a brisk woman with a voice like chalk. Her name was Preston. She managed to convey, in every syllable, that death was a dreadful inconvenience, especially when it occurred within college property. She handed me a stack of letters found on the late Dr. Halberd's desk. Her name, I learned then, the owner of that lifeless room. The handwriting was precise, unhurried. The last letter remained unfinished, a half-formed sentence that ended with the word, therefore. I've always been troubled by unfinished thoughts. They leave one suspended like a pedestrian waiting for a light that never changes. The room itself had been sealed, but I persuaded the porter to let me in once more. The gas fire was off now, the air colder but less accusing. The faint trace of perfume lingered violet, perhaps mixed with the flat tang of gas that clung to the curtains. I walked toward the book she'd been reading. Middlemarch, a heavy choice for a quiet evening. The page was still marked where I had found it, but now, beneath the printed words, something caught my eye. A pencil mark, barely visible. A faint line drawn under a sentence. There are many wonderful mixtures of good and evil in the world. It might have meant nothing, a reader's idle agreement. Yet I noticed the pencil itself was not on the table. It was on the mantel beside the brass bell. A small thing, but small things make their own kind of noise when one listens closely. Lewis entered, rubbing his hands against the cold. He mentioned that the gas tap had been partially turned, not fully open, and that someone had removed the window latch altogether, as though ensuring a draught. It was his way of asking if I thought she had really meant to die. I didn't answer. Instead, I found myself studying a photograph of the Mantella group of students, young women in gowns standing before the college chapel. Dr. Halberd was at the centre, her hand resting lightly on one girl's shoulder. The girl, I noticed, was not smiling. The name on the back was smudged, but legible enough, L&B followed by a year. 1978, I did not yet know why the name mattered, but the human mind, like Oxford itself, has a habit of storing mysteries in its attics long before admitting they exist. As I turned to leave, something fluttered from beneath the armchair, cushioned a loose sheet torn from an exercise book. A few lines written in pencil, the handwriting hurried, but recognizably the same as the letters on the desk. He knows there will be no meeting. The truth cannot survive us both. No signature, no date. Lewis read it beside me, exhaling slowly. He asked who I thought he was. I said it might be anyone, an old lover, a rival, or simply an idea she had grown tired of defending. Then I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, though I wasn't sure yet whether I meant to keep it or confess to having found it. Outside, the bells began again, muffled by the damp air. I stood a moment beneath the cloister, watching the rain begin anew, and thought how odd it was that we speak of suicide as solitude, when it so often leaves behind a crowd. The books, the notes, the marginalia, all those faint echoes of someone still thinking, still arguing, long after silence has taken the rest. That night, back in my flat, I opened Middlemarch again and found the same line she had marked. I underlined it once more, darker this time. Not in agreement, but as if to remind the dead that someone was still reading. There is a particular kind of silence peculiar to colleges at dusk, a silence not of absence, but of containment. Every sound seems to know its place, The squeak of a bicycle, the tap of a porter's keys, the faint clatter of crockery in the senior common room. Even the ghosts, I sometimes think, observe curfew. I returned to St. Hilda's that evening for the meeting with the college fellows. It had been hastily arranged under the polite pretense of procedural cooperation. I have attended such gatherings before polite inquisitions where guilt, like sherry, is poured sparingly and with an air of regret. The room they chose was the old dining hall, the one that smelled faintly of varnish and baked custard, its portraits leaning forward as though eavesdropping. There were 5 of them. The warden, a woman with eyes so pale they might have been carved from glass. Beside her sat 2 historians, a mathematician and a priest who taught philosophy. I found myself thinking, not for the first time, that death always draws a better audience than life. The warden began with a carefully worded condolence. Dr. Halberd, she said, had been a woman of rigorous intellect and occasional melancholy. There was, of course, no reason to suspect anything beyond the obvious. Yet the word obvious in her tone carried the weight of expectation as if to declare the matter settled before I had even sat down. Lewis took notes while I listened. They spoke of her health, her solitary habits, her reputation for kindness, mingled with an occasional cruelty of judgment. A scholar's cruelty is the sort that wounds only those who value opinion. I asked about her students. There was a pause. Then one of the historians, an elderly man with hands mottled like old marble, mentioned Ellen Burgess. The name was spoken softly, almost fondly, as though invoking a ghost not yet laid to rest. She had been, he said, a prodigy of sorts, promising, difficult, disappeared after an unfortunate affair. The word affair lingered in the air, heavy with the English embarrassment of unspoken scandal. I asked when this was. 1978, the warden replied, the year written on the back of that photograph. While they spoke, my attention drifted toward the long oak table. Someone had etched initials into its edge years ago, barely visible in the varnish. I traced them absently, E.B., and beneath them, faintly carved, an H. A strange pairing, intimate but hesitant. It seemed unlikely that the college would tolerate such vandalism from students, unless the initials belonged to someone beyond reprimand. When the meeting ended, the warden asked, with courteous irritation, whether I truly thought there was anything suspicious. I said that I thought many things, but that suspicion was not one of them. It was an answer designed to offend no one and enlighten nothing, a useful trick in rooms where truth was a matter of consensus. Outside, Lewis waited by the car, his face caught between pity and impatience. He asked if I believed what they'd said, the story of an old tutor undone by loneliness. I told him that belief was a dangerous comfort in this line of work. We deal, I said, not in faith, but in the residue it leaves behind. As we drove away, I looked back once. The college loomed against the river, its windows alight, its shadows still. There is something about those buildings that preserve not only knowledge, but guilt, carefully catalogued and left to age. I thought of the carved initials, the line in the book, the note about truth and survival. 3 fragments of something larger, circling one another like moths before a flame. Later in my flat, I took out the photograph again. The girl, Ellen, stared into the camera, unsmiling. Behind her, in the blurred corner, a faint shape, a figure perhaps, or merely a trick of light against stone. I stared at it for a long while until I could no longer tell whether it was memory or imagination. Oxford is full of ghosts after all. Some are merely better educated. It was the librarian who remembered her first. A small, tremulous woman with the voice of one accustomed to silence, who spoke as though each word had to earn its right to disturb the air. She told me that Ellen Burgess had been fond of the upper reading room, particularly the carol beneath the south window, the one with the cracked pane that whistled faintly when the wind turned east. I knew it well. I had once sat there myself many years earlier, pretending to study but really listening to the rain gather in the gutters outside. The librarian said Ellen read aloud, not loudly, not theatrically, just audibly enough that others might glance up, puzzled, then return to their books. Latin verses, she said. Sometimes Horace, sometimes Lucretius. Always the originals, never the translations. There was, she added, a rhythm to it, not performance but confession. I asked when she had last seen her. A pause followed. Long pauses are Oxford's second language. She thought perhaps the spring of 78, the day after her Viva. Ellen had come to return a borrowed volume, Catullus, with a maroon binding, and had asked whether Dr. Halberd still kept her tutorials in the old rooms by the river. She did, of course, and that had been all. The librarian's eyes grew distant then, as though replaying some faint sound long buried in the dust. She said Ellen had left something behind that day. A notebook, slim, green, unremarkable. It had lain among the unclaimed items for years until the shelf had been cleared last autumn, but she remembered the name inside the cover. Written neatly in pencil, Ellen Burgess, Corpus Christi College. When I left the library, the air was thick with drizzle. The streets shone like paper just before the ink bleeds. I walked toward Corpus, though I had no real reason to. The porter on duty was a man I half remembered from earlier cases, polite, suspicious, unhelpfully discreet. Ellen's name meant nothing to him. Yet when I mentioned Halberd, something in his expression tightened, not fear, precisely recognition with regret. He recalled her visiting the college once, unofficially, long after Ellen had gone. He remembered because she had stood at the gate, not crossing the threshold, as though waiting for someone to emerge who never did. Lewis joined me later, shaking the rain from his coat. He said forensics had finished with the scene, nothing new. No fingerprints beyond Halberd's. No second cup, no sign of entry. I told him not everything that matters leaves a mark. He muttered something about poetry again, and I let it pass. That evening, back in my room, I took down my own Latin dictionary, a habit from another life, and searched for the phrase she might have whispered. Amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all, a truism perhaps, but there are other lines less remembered. Omnia vincit amor, et nocedimus amori. Love conquers all. Let us, too, yield to love. The surrender is the part most forget. Among Halberd's papers was a list of her former students written years ago for a departmental review, names, dates, brief remarks. Next to Ellen's brilliant, undisciplined, too much feeling for a scholar, I found myself rereading that line as though it contained more than it said. Scholars who feel too much are always punished for it. Later, as I sat by the window, the bells of Corpus began to toll. Their sound was softer here, cushioned by distance, but each note seemed to touch the air like fingertips on glass. I thought again of the girl in the photograph, the one who did not smile, and wondered what she had been reciting when no one listened. Perhaps something about love, or truth, or the silence that follows both. And in that moment, I felt, though I could not prove, that the voice which once filled that reading room had never entirely left it, that some part of her still lingered there between the dust and the Latin, whispering into the stone. Oxford keeps its dead kindly, if not quietly. There are certain evenings in Oxford when the air feels like it's been poured from a decanter, rich, faintly perfumed, and just old enough to make one believe that time itself has oxidized. That night was such a one. I had accepted an invitation to dine at St. Hilda's, an event arranged, I suspected, not out of hospitality but curiosity. The fellows wished to know how much I knew. It is an old university tradition, when in doubt, feed the investigator and watch what he drinks. The hall was smaller than I remembered, though perhaps it was the candlelight that made it shrink. Conversation fluttered at the edges like moths against linen. I was seated between the warden and a retired theologian whose breath carried the faint sweetness of port and regret. Across from me sat Lewis, who regarded the silver service with the cautious reverence of a man uncertain whether he was allowed to touch it. The wine was claret. 1978, the year Ellen Burgess vanished. Someone had chosen it deliberately, a detail not lost on me, though I kept the observation folded away, like a note too personal to read aloud. The warden asked whether I preferred red to white. I said I preferred truth to both, though I found it easier to swallow with the former. She smiled the way people smile when they do not understand but wish to appear tolerant of riddles. Dinner progressed in the usual polite absurdities, talk of funding, publications, the decline of Latin as a living language. It was when the pudding arrived, something delicate and overthought, that the conversation turned inevitably to Dr. Halberd. Someone described her as brilliant but lonely, a combination that always ends either in sainthood or scandal. I asked gently which they thought it had been. No one answered. The claret had breathed enough to show its flaws by then. It carried a faint taste of iron, as though it had remembered the soil too well. I lifted my glass and noticed, in the reflection, the pale shimmer of the brass bell, now sitting on a sideboard behind the warden. The same bell from Halberd's sitting room. I had not been told it was removed. When I asked, she said it had been returned to college property. A sentimental relic. But it was not sentiment that left the faint, powdery smear beneath its handle, the same as before. Talcum, plaster, dust, I had still not decided. Yet something about its placement struck me. It stood beside a bottle identical to the one on Halberd's table the night she died. College-issue claret. I leaned back, my mind assembling patterns it did not yet wish to name. Later, as the guests thinned and the port was passed, the theologian beside me grew talkative. He mentioned that Halberd had once served as the college wine steward, unofficially, of course. She had a palate, he said, that could shame half the cellars in Oxford. It was she who had insisted years ago that the college buy that 1978 vintage in bulk, for sentimental reasons. I asked if she'd ever spoken of Ellen Burgess. The theologian's eyes dipped, glass midway to his lips. "Only once," he murmured. She said the girl had ruined something precious. He could not remember what. When I left, the night had settled into mist. Lewis drove in silence until we reached the High. Then he asked whether I thought the wine mattered. I told him that in Oxford, wine always matters, especially when it's poured to commemorate the year of a disappearance. Back in my flat, I uncorked a bottle of my own. Nothing remarkable about a cheap Bordeaux, reliable in its mediocrity. Yet as I tasted it, I thought of Halberd, of the photograph, the carved initials, the smudge beneath the bell. It came to me then, quietly but certainly, that the hand which had poured her final glass had known its history well, perhaps even too well, and for the first time the taste of the claret in my mouth was not of wine at all, but of memory, sharp, unfiltered. It was the music that drew me there, or so I told myself. Evening rehearsal at St. Barnabas, the air inside thick with dust and devotion. Oxford's choirs are full of contradiction, students half in love with God, half in love with the sound of their own contrition. I had gone not for the hymns, but for the small promise of order that music offers to the restless, each voice obedient to its place. Each silence is deliberate. Lewis waited by the door, uncomfortable as always in sacred places. He never quite knew whether to bow or cough. We were not there officially. The coroner's inquest into Dr. Halbert's death had been set for the following week, and I had been told to rest. But rest is a foreign habit to the curious. The choir was mid-rehearsal when we entered Parry, I think, though played too briskly for my taste. Among the altos was a face I recognized, though not immediately. It was the librarian from St. Hilda's, her voice small but steady, her eyes avoiding mine. When the conductor stopped for a correction, she slipped out through the side aisle and pretended to be surprised at finding me there. She said she hadn't expected to see me. I told her that it was the two of us. Her hands were folded around a hymn book, though she didn't seem to know she was holding it. I asked if she'd ever known Ellen Burgess personally. She hesitated the pause again, the Oxford pause, then said she remembered her voice. Not her words, just the tone. Ellen had read scripture for the Advent service one year. Flawless Latin, no falter, no tremor. The congregation, she said, had been spellbound. There was something about the way she said it, as though the performance itself had been dangerous, an act of beauty too precise to be forgiven. The conductor called her back, but she lingered. She asked if I believed in ghosts. I told her I believed in memory, which is more persistent. She smiled faintly as though that answer had confirmed her fears. Then she said the strangest thing, that someone had been sitting in Ellen's old seat during evensong the past 3 Sundays, long before Dr. Halbert died. She hadn't recognized him, but the hymn book was left open each time to the same page, Desiree, the day of wrath. Lewis dismissed it as coincidence, but coincidence in Oxford is usually the polite face of consequence. I walked along the pews after rehearsal, the air still trembling with the last note. The book lay where she had said. The page corners were faintly smudged, the way paper darkens beneath damp fingertips. The number at the top, 213, stayed in my mind. Numbers often do. They are small, faithful things that pretend not to mean anything until they do. Outside, the bells of St. Giles struck 9. The city was half mist, half music. I could see the glow of the Bodleian across the street, its windows breathing gold into the fog. Lewis offered a lift, but I walked instead. The rain had begun again, softly this time, like a rehearsal of its own. At the crossroads near Randolph I paused. There was a poster on the lamp-post, an old one, peeling, announcing a memorial lecture from 2 years past, The Ethics of Confession in the Classical World. The speaker's name was familiar, Dr. Margaret Halbert. The sponsor is Corpus Christi College. I wondered then whether Ellen had ever attended, listening quietly from the back, her Latin still echoing in her mind. Later, at home, I sat at the piano and played a few notes from Dies Irae. The melody, stark and inevitable, moved downward as if descending into itself. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th phrase, I understood, or thought I understood, why Halbert had kept the bell on her mantle, and why she'd chosen that book, that passage, that year's claret. Not proof, not yet. Just the first faint outline of meaning beneath the noise, and impossible to spit out. It was the music that drew me there, or so I told myself. Evening rehearsal at St. Barnabas, the air inside thick with dust and devotion. Oxford's choirs are full of contradiction, students half in love with God, half in love with the sound of their own contrition. I had gone not for the hymns, but for the small promise of order that music offers to the restless. Each voice, obedient to its place, each silence is deliberate. Lewis waited by the door, uncomfortable as always in sacred places. He never quite knew whether to bow or cough. We were not there officially. The coroner's inquest into Dr. Halbert's death had been set for the following week, and I had been told to rest. But rest is a foreign habit to the curious. The choir was mid-rehearsal when we entered Parry, I think, though played too briskly for my taste. Among the altos was a face I recognized, though not immediately. It was the librarian from St. Hilda's, her voice small but steady, her eyes avoiding mine. When the conductor stopped for a correction, she slipped out through the side aisle and pretended to be surprised at finding me there. She said she hadn't expected to see me. I told her that it was the two of us. Her hands were folded around a hymn book, though she didn't seem to know she was holding it. I asked if she'd ever known Ellen Burgess personally. She hesitated the pause again, the Oxford pause, then said she remembered her voice. Not her words, just the tone. Ellen had read scripture for the Advent service one year, flawless Latin, no falter, no tremor. The congregation, she said, had been spellbound. There was something about the way she said it, as though the performance itself had been dangerous, an act of beauty, too precise to be forgiven. The conductor called her back, but she lingered. She asked if I believed in ghosts. I told her I believed in memory, which is more persistent. She smiled faintly as though that answer had confirmed her fears. Then she said the strangest thing, that someone had been sitting in Ellen's old seat during evensong the past 3 Sundays, long before Dr. Halberd died. She hadn't recognized him, but the hymn book was left open each time to the same page, Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath. Lewis dismissed it as coincidence, but coincidence in Oxford is usually the polite face of consequence. I walked along the pews after rehearsal, the air still trembling with the last note. The book lay where she had said. The page corners were faintly smudged, the way paper darkens beneath damp fingertips. The number at the top, 213, stayed in my mind. Numbers often do. They are small, faithful things that pretend not to mean anything until they do. Outside, the bells of St. Giles struck 9. The city was half mist, half music. I could see the glow of the Bodleian across the street, its windows breathing gold into the fog. Lewis offered a lift, but I walked instead. The rain had begun again, softly this time, like a rehearsal of its own. At the crossroads near Randolph, I paused. There was a poster on the lamp-post, an old one, peeling, announcing a memorial lecture from 2 years past, The Ethics of Confession in the Classical World. The speaker's name was familiar. Dr. Margaret Halberd. The sponsor is Corpus Christi College. I wondered then whether Ellen had ever attended, listening quietly from the back, her Latin still echoing in her mind. Later at home, I sat at the piano and played a few notes from Dies Irae. The melody, stark and inevitable, moved downward as if descending into itself. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th phrase, I understood, or thought I understood, why Halberd had kept the bell on her mantle, and why she'd chosen that book, that passage, that year's claret. Not proof, not yet, just the first faint outline of meaning beneath the noise. It was a Thursday, the kind of afternoon that promised rain but refused to deliver it. The light hung over Oxford in that peculiar half-state, not gold, not grey, the colour of indecision itself. I had spent the morning rereading my notes, searching for the shape of something that had yet to declare itself. Every case begins as noise, the chatter of evidence, the hum of testimony. What matters is not volume, but tone. Lewis arrived shortly before lunch, bearing 2 cups of tea and a copy of the Oxford Gazette. He said there was someone I ought to meet. A lecturer at Corpus, name of Dr. Adrian Collingwood. He had apparently written a paper linking Roman elegy with moral transgression, the sort of work that made headlines in precisely no papers at all. But he had been, Lewis added, a friend of both Halberd and Ellen Burgess. Corpus looked unusually severe that day. The drizzle had begun at last, and the stone gleamed like wet parchment. Collingwood's rooms were on the top floor, overlooking the quad. The corridor smelled faintly of chalk and pipe tobacco. He greeted us with the restrained courtesy of a man who reads people as footnotes. He claimed to remember Ellen vividly, too vividly, perhaps. She had been his student once, though unofficially. A fascination, he said, with Latin poetry, particularly Ovid's Amores. He smiled when he said it, a small, private smile that seemed to belong to another life. I asked if Halberd knew. He said she must have. After all, she corrected his translations from time to time. The room was crowded with books, their spines faded to anonymity. On his desk lay a manuscript half covered by a sheet of paper. A single Latin phrase was visible: Amor ut lacrima ab oculo cadit. Love, like a tear, falls from the eye. I pointed to it. He said it was Ellen's translation. She had left it for him after their last tutorial. I asked what had happened between them. He said something vague that intellect, when shared too closely, breeds a kind of intimacy mistaken for love. Then, after a pause, he admitted that Halberd had warned him. She had said Ellen's mind was dangerous, that her brilliance came with the corrosion of empathy. He seemed to find this tragic, though not untrue. While he spoke, my gaze wandered to the window. The rain had intensified, tracing thin paths down the glass. On the sill sat a small glass decanter, half full of what looked like claret. I asked about it. He said it was a gift from Halberd years ago. The same vintage, he added, as the bottle she had kept at home. A quiet connection, overlooked by everyone but the past. Lewis, ever literal, asked whether he thought her death was suicide. Collingwood shrugged. He said she had always believed in the Roman manner that life, when dishonoured, should be concluded with elegance. But his voice betrayed something else. Relief, perhaps, or guilt mistaken for grief. It was as he poured himself another glass that I noticed the scar on his thumb, a thin white line, recent, almost surgical. He caught me looking, said he'd cut himself opening a cork 2 nights earlier. I didn't reply. I simply nodded, letting the silence perform its own interrogation. When we left, the bells of Corpus began again, their sound merging with the rain in a kind of weary music. Lewis muttered that the man was odd, and I agreed, but oddity, in Oxford, is never diagnostic, only expected. Back in my flat that evening, I poured a measure of whisky and opened Ovid's Amores. I found the passage Ellen had once translated. It spoke of a lover undone not by betrayal, but by the memory of being understood too completely. The words seemed to hum quietly between the lines, as though written not for reading, but for haunting. That night, as I set the book aside, I realized something simple. Every dead language waits for someone reckless enough to resurrect it. And perhaps Ellen Burgess had done just that in more ways than one. It was raining again, but in Oxford that is hardly an event worth remarking on. The kind of rain that falls politely, persistent, but self-effacing as though aware of its long tenure. I found myself walking toward the north gate of St. Hilda's without having meant to. There are places the mind returns to even after the case has already begun to close around it. The porter recognized me, or pretended not to. He said the warden wished to speak with me immediately, if possible. Her office was lit with a steady, lamp-like calm that made the rest of the corridor appear embarrassed by its gloom. She stood by the window, watching the river's slow pulse through the drizzle. When she turned, her composure was so deliberate that it felt rehearsed. She asked whether the inquest would be reopened. I told her that depended on whether we discovered anything worth reopening it for. Her expression didn't flicker. Then she said that Dr. Halberd had left a sealed envelope in her keeping. It had been entrusted some weeks before her death with the strict instruction that it be destroyed unread should anything happen to her. But she had not destroyed it. She handed me the envelope unopened. The handwriting was precise, slightly angular, the kind that belongs to people who trust language more than they should. My instinct was to open it, but I didn't. Some promises, even posthumous ones, deserve to linger. Instead, I asked whether she had cried. She seemed startled, almost offended by the question. She said she hadn't, because intellect is the only reliable form of grief. Then she added, after a pause, that the envelope had been sealed with wine. The same claret the college had ordered in 1978. It was an unnecessary detail, the sort people mention, to disguise something else. I noticed then the faint stain on her desk blotter, a small ring left by a glass recently lifted. There was no bottle in sight. She followed my glance and said she had poured it away earlier, but the scent of sharp metallic lingered too distinctly for that to be true. I thanked her and left the envelope in my coat pocket. Lewis was waiting in the car, tapping the steering wheel with the blunt patience of a man who has never trusted rain or women who don't cry. I said nothing until we reached the bridge. Then I told him that Halbert's death was beginning to feel less like a tragedy and more like punctuation, a deliberate stop at the end of someone else's sentence. He asked what I meant. I said I wasn't sure yet, but that people who write in Latin often think in endings. That night, back in my flat, I poured myself a whiskey and stared at the envelope on the table. It seemed to breathe faintly with the damp. The seal, once deep crimson, had dried to a darker, almost brown shade. I noticed a small indentation beside it, as though a ring had pressed there before the wax hardened. The same shape, I realized, as the one on the warden's hand. I thought of Ellen Burgess, then the vanished girl who read Latin aloud, who left her notebook in a library and her silence in the air. Perhaps the warden had not cried for Halberd because grief had already been spent on someone else. Or perhaps, as she said, intellect was the purer sorrow, the kind that bleeds inward, staining nothing visible. I did not open the letter. Not then. There are moments when knowledge feels like a form of trespass, and I had trespassed enough that day. Instead, I turned off the light, left the envelope where it lay, and listened to the rain against the glass. Somewhere beyond the city, a train's horn carried faintly through the mist a long, mournful note that sounded for a moment like a woman finally remembering how to cry. It was late when I found myself back in the college library. The lights had been dimmed for closing, and the silence had that particular density that comes only after books have stopped breathing. I hadn't intended to return. These things rarely begin with intention. One simply walks in the direction where the unanswered question seems loudest. The librarian had gone home, leaving her keys with the porter. I moved quietly between the shelves, the air cold and faintly metallic, as though the words had long ago oxidized. On the central table lay a volume of Horace, left open and spine-cracked, its margins faintly scored by someone's pencil. It wasn't the book I had come to find, yet something about it held me there, the ordinary carelessness of a reader interrupted. I traced the penciled line with my finger. It ran beneath a Latin phrase I half remembered from school, pulvis et umbra sumus. We are but dust and shadow. The line was faint, almost apologetic, but next to it, smaller, neater, was a second hand correcting the translation beneath. The first had written ashes and light. The second had crossed out light and replaced it with shadow. It seemed trivial at first, a minor academic quibble, but it wasn't. It was a conversation one conducted silently across the margins of a book. I knew that hand. I had seen it before, in an envelope sealed with wine. I sat for a long while, the sound of the rain seeping faintly through the windows. Then I checked the borrowing record. The book had last been signed out 23 years ago. The name, faded but legible, Ellen Burgess. I could almost see her there, the girl who read Latin aloud, whispering the lines softly under her breath. Perhaps she had written ashes and light to comfort herself, to find some beauty in mortality. And perhaps Halberd, years later, had crossed it out, restoring the scholar's truth while undoing the girl's hope. I left the library with the phrase still circling my mind. Dust and shadow. Latin is mercilessly precise. There is no room for misreading unless one wishes to. I have always thought that misreading is the closest thing we have to mercy. Lewis was waiting in the car outside, a takeaway cup of coffee steaming in his hand. He asked if I'd found anything. I told him, perhaps too quietly, that I had found a mistake, the kind that kills people slowly. He looked puzzled, but didn't press. He has learned over time that meaning ripens best in silence. On the drive back, the streets glistened, slick with rain. The city lights pooled in the gutters like fallen constellations. Somewhere in the distance, a college clock struck 11, the sound hesitant, as though unsure it had the right. At home, I placed the book on my desk beside the envelope. The two belonged to each other, text and footnote, question and reply. I stared at the handwriting again, its precision almost tender. Then, without quite meaning to, I broke the seal. Inside was a single page, folded once, no signature, no greeting, just a line, handwritten in the same narrow script. There are those who live in translation and those who die by it. Nothing else. It was not a confession. It was something lonelier than a correction. The echo of that margin note ashes and light, crossed out for accuracy's sake. I poured a whiskey and read the line again. The glass trembled faintly against the wood. I thought then of Halberd, of her meticulous mind, her refusal to let feelings distort fact. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of intellect is that it cannot forgive error, even when the error is the only thing that makes life bearable. I left the paper where it lay. The rain had stopped by then, and the night outside seemed oddly clear, rinsed clean of its own uncertainties. But the line stayed with me. We are dust and shadow, yes. But once, however briefly, we were also light, even if we misread the word. I have always thought that churches hold their secrets more patiently than people do. They wait, quietly, until time itself forgets what it came to hide. That evening, St. Barnabas was almost empty. A rehearsal had finished an hour before, the choir dispersed, the echo of their voices still hanging like breath in the upper air. I had come alone, or rather, I had come to be alone, though Oxford has a way of giving solitude to an audience. The verger let me in without question. He knew my face by then. I walked down the aisle, past the pews still faintly warm from recent bodies, until I reached the small staircase leading up beneath the organ loft. The air there smelled of wax and dust, that particular scent of devotion long surrendered. She was waiting for me. The warden. Her posture was composed, almost regal, though her hands betrayed her restless, folding one over the other like pages of an unwritten apology. She said she thought I would come. I told her I didn't think she had left me much choice. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The organ pipes loomed above, tall as accusations. Then she asked if I had read the letter. I said I had. Her eyes closed briefly, as though in relief or resignation. She said she hadn't meant for it to be found, that Halberd had asked her to destroy it because truth, once written, tends to rot faster than lies. I asked how well she had known Ellen Burgess. The question seemed to pull something sharp from beneath the surface of her composure. She said she had loved her not romantically, though she would not have denied it if it were true. She had loved her because Ellen made words feel alive again, as though Latin itself had remembered how to breathe. But then Halberd intervened. She called it protection. The warden called it possession. She turned away then, her voice low, steady. She said Ellen hadn't disappeared. She had drowned, the river behind St. Hilda's. No one had looked too closely because Halberd's influence was considerable, and grief, like authority, silences questions. The college accepted it as an accident. She, however, had not. I asked what she meant by the confession. She gestured toward the small iron gate behind her, leading to a narrow chamber beneath the loft. There, she said, was where Halberd had come to pray. Or pretend to. I followed her down. The steps were slick with condensation, the walls damp and mottled. At the bottom stood an old wooden chest, the kind used for vestments. Inside, wrapped in linen cloth, was a single object, the brass bell. I lifted it gently. Beneath the dust, the faint residue of that powdery smear still clung to its handle. But now I understand. Not plaster, not talcum. Lime, quicklime, the kind once used to hasten decay. I looked up, at her, and she met my gaze without fear. She said Halberd had confessed here, in this chamber. That she had admitted to what had happened was not murder, precisely, but a choice of indifference. Ellen had fallen, or jumped, or wandered too near the riverbank. Halberd had seen, had hesitated, had let the current finish what argument could not. And afterward she had carried the bell from her old rooms to this place, ringing it softly during her prayers, as though penance might carry sound across water. When I asked why she was telling me now, the warden smiled faintly. Because, she said, the truth needs a witness, even if it doesn't deserve one. Then she turned and walked up into the nave, her footsteps hollow, deliberate. I stayed there a long while, listening to the silence settle back into its shape. Above, the faint wind through the organ pipes began to hum, low and uncertain, like a breath caught between confession and forgiveness. And I thought then, not for the first time, that in Oxford, sin is never buried. It is archived. There are rooms in Oxford that exist beyond time, places where dust itself seems to have tenure. The archive beneath St. Hilda's was one of them. It had taken a week of negotiation, several signatures, and a reluctant key to open it. Even then the porter had muttered that the door hadn't been unlocked in years. Inside, the air felt thick with old intentions. Stacks of files leaned against the walls, their labels half-peeled, their strings frayed to memory. I moved through the narrow aisles as one might through a confessional, my breath clouding faintly in the cold. Lewis, predictably, was unimpressed. He said it smelled like dead paper. I told him that was exactly what it was. The records we sought were from 1978 faculty correspondence, college minutes, and disciplinary notes. A year so well catalogued in grief that no one had noticed its gaps. I found the box by instinct, not by label. It was heavier than I expected. Inside 3 manila folders, a ledger, and a photograph identical to the one on Halberd's mantel. The same group, the same unsmiling girl. But this version had not been cropped. In the corner stood Collingwood, the lecturer who knew too much Latin, his hand resting on Ellen's shoulder instead of Halberd's. I stared at the photograph for a long time. The gesture wasn't affectionate. It was proprietorial, the subtle claim of a man who believes knowledge entitles him to affection. I had seen it before, in seminar rooms, in common rooms, in life. The smallest touch, the largest trespass. Lewis was reading aloud from a letter he'd found in the ledger. A complaint filed and never pursued. It referred to inappropriate supervision between a student and a member of faculty. The name was redacted, but the dates and context were enough. I asked him to note it down, though we both knew it would lead nowhere officially. Oxford has always buried its improprieties under Latin and marble. Then, beneath the ledger, I found something stranger. A single page torn from a student essay, folded neatly. The handwriting was Ellen's. At the top, On the Ethics of Confession in the Classical World. The same title as Halbert's later lecture. The body of text was brief, unfinished. Confession is not the admission of guilt, she had written, but the hope that someone will translate our silence correctly. The line struck me harder than it should have, perhaps because it was the only thing left that sounded alive. I asked Lewis to step outside while I finished. When he was gone, I replaced the photograph and papers exactly as I'd found them, except for the essay. That I kept. I told myself it was for evidence, but it was something closer to preservation. As I locked the archive door, I felt that peculiar stillness one associates with endings not resolution, but exhaustion. Outside, the college bells began to toll. The sound seemed muffled, as though travelling through water. I thought of Ellen again, the girl by the river, her Latin verses carried downstream. Later, in my flat, I read her line again beneath the lamplight. The words blurred slightly where my glass had left a ring on the page. Confession is not the admission of guilt. She had been right, of course. It is the human attempt to be understood before history rewrites the translation. That night, I wrote my report, sparing everyone the ugliness of proof. Collingwood had already resigned on grounds of ill health. The warden had taken sabbatical leave, indefinite and deserved. The coroner's verdict remained unchanged. Suicide, with qualification. Before I turned in, I placed Ellen's essay inside my copy of Middlemarch, the one Halbert had been reading when she died. It seemed as fitting a resting place as any book about conscience, about women misunderstood, about the quiet erosion of the soul through intellect. When I closed the cover, a line from Dorothea's final pages came back to me, something about the unvisited tombs of unhistoric acts. I think that's what Oxford really is, an archive of unhistoric acts. All the lives that never made enough noise to be remembered, yet refused to disappear completely. I poured one last whisky, left the light burning low, and told myself, not for the first time, that justice and truth are rarely the same thing, only that both require keeping the archive open a little longer. It was the last week of Hilary Term, and Oxford wore its fatigue like an old coat, elegant still, but frayed at the edges. The students were already leaving in drifts, their laughter carrying faintly through the drizzle that had settled once again over the city. The quad at St. Hilda's stood empty, except for a single bicycle, its saddle slick with rain, its lock rusted with neglect. The kind of detail one notices only when the story is over. Lewis said it felt like closure. He has a fondness for ending simple, declarative ones where the bad are punished and the good forgiven. I've learned not to tell him that Oxford doesn't trade in those currencies. Here, guilt is an elective subject, and truth is often deferred until the examiner retires. The report was finished, filed, and quietly forgotten. Collingwood had vanished into the administrative ether, a sabbatical, a retreat, an unspoken dismissal. The warden had resigned on grounds of health, which in this city means weariness of conscience, and Halbert's death had been tidied into the archive of unfortunate endings, where the paper yellows faster than the memory. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about Ellen Burgess. Not the student she had been, but the silence she left behind. Every case leaves its echo, and hers lingered like the final chord of an unresolved hymn. That afternoon I walked through the Botanic Garden, the air damp and sweet with the faint promise of spring. It was here, they said, that Halbert used to read under the yew near the river path. The bench was still there, slick with moss. I sat for a while, watching the rain darken the river until its surface became indistinguishable from the sky. There's a peculiar melancholy to academic cities in the rain. They make you believe that knowledge might have been enough, if only you'd studied harder or loved less. I took out Ellen's essay, the one line she'd left unfinished, and read it again beneath the grey light. Confession is not the admission of guilt, but the hope that someone will translate our silence correctly. A small deduction had come to me days earlier, though I had refused to name it. The Latin line halberd had underlined pulvis et umbra, sumus dust and shadow. In Ellen's hand, the translation had read ashes and light. It wasn't a mistranslation at all, it was defiance, a refusal to accept the scholar's cynicism. Perhaps in the end, that was what halberd couldn't forgive the girl's insistence on hope. Lewis joined me by the gate, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He said they were closing the case officially tomorrow. I asked what that meant. He said it meant the same as always, that it would no longer belong to us. We stood in silence, watching a group of students hurry past, their laughter echoing against the iron railings. The sound was oddly comforting, though I couldn't have said why. Oxford endures because youth insists upon forgetting. The rest of us, I suppose, simply linger in its margins. That night, back in my room, I opened the window to the drizzle and poured myself a final whiskey. The bell from St. Barnabas began to toll the hour, soft and deliberate, its echo travelling across the city's wet roofs. I thought of halberd, of the warden, of Collingwood, 3 minds too proud to forgive their own errors, and of Ellen, whose absence had become the only honest confession among them. Before I turned off the lamp, I slipped her essay between the pages of my dictionary, where the word umbra lay beside its translation shade, shadow, reflection. But in the margins, I wrote a new one, afterlight. I suppose every investigation leaves you with one word you can't quite translate. This was mine.